That I
If you thought that was a good idea, I could post on the website. Yeah, how many people. You gotta give people. I think the way to get it across is to the number of consultations. We're very shy. They don't work. People on the chairs to be able to hold that. Ongoing discussion. Was not true. He said he did something because I say these.
I don't know if it's really what the congregation is. It's not good.
So I always, whenever I want to do something, I always have a little bit. They would say yes. We could have to turn you down. If you also have to. You gotta put some taxes in. I mean, that mailing. You should know some. Nobody will double check it, trust me. Whatever you want.
We want to go. You know what it
All right, everybody can take their seats. Welcome. Well, welcome everybody to the Cathedral of Pines. Wow, it's so awesome that everybody was able to come out with the snow flurries taking place and change in temperatures dropping. But we are super excited to be the host today for the MLK keynote address. And for those of you who are not familiar with the cathedral, our mission is one to promote the legacy of the war dead and veterans and their families' health and well-being. With that said, peace, honor, respect, that is at the core of what we do, and we welcome you anytime. Our grounds are always open. We have beautiful gardens. We have a memorial cemetery for the military down below, and miles of hiking trails. So With that said, we have the honor of a wonderful speaker, Dr. Michael Klarman, and he's the Harvard Law Professor for Constitution Law, and we're incredibly happy to bring him here today as a result of the hard work of those with the MLK committee. And what I'd like is to introduce everybody and just stand real quick and give them a quick hand. Peggy Urita, Stephanie Fox Suarez, Owen Houghton, Andrea Rivera, Megan Newton, and Judy Young. So with that, my name is Michelle Lowe. I'm the executive director here at the Cathedral of the Pines. I extend a wholehearted warm welcome to everyone, and please don't be a stranger. And I'm going to have Stephanie introduce the professor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the first of two events that are planned by the Jaffrey-Rindge MLK Committee. So I'm Stephanie Cox Suarez, and I'm a Rindge resident and a member of the MLK Committee and an incorporator here at the Cathedral of the Pines. We're excited about this co-sponsored event with hopes of learning together and appreciating the beautiful and historic grounds of the Cathedral of the Pines, which honors our veterans. So today we have a presentation by Dr. Michael Klarman entitled Brown versus Board, the Civil Rights Movement and Where We Are Today on Race. And tomorrow at 5 at the Park Theater, we've planned a family-friendly community event highlighting Dr. Cindy John, whose family moved here to Rindge from Haiti. Her talk is In Search of a Dream, How Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Paved the way for immigrants like me. So do join us tomorrow as well. So thank you, Dr. Klarman, for joining us today. We've been looking forward to your visit. He is the Charles Warren Professor of Legal History at Harvard Law School, where he joined the faculty in 2008. He is an American legal historian who specializes in the constitutional history of race. After finishing law school at Stanford, Klarman worked for the Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. His first book, From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, The Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equality, was published in 2004, and he received the Bancroft Prize in History. Two books published in 2007 by the Oxford University Press include Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement, and another book called Unfinished Business, Racial Equality in American History. In 2012, he published From the Closet to the Altar, Courts, Backlash, and Struggle for Same-Sex Marriage. His latest book is The Farmer's Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution. So Dr. Klarman's going to speak for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have time with the professor for some questions and answers. Feel free anytime to get up and keep taking those refreshments. And we want you to be comfortable, so some people found some good chairs to sit back there. So Dr. Klarman.
I'm a very loud speaker, so I'm guessing you can hear me. If anybody in the back has any problem, let me know. It's okay? Yeah, okay. But the students who sit in the front row tend to be blasted out of their seats. Speak loud. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Martin Luther King Jr. would have been 95 years old tomorrow. In honor of his birthday, I'm going to give you a two-part talk. The first part is about the connections between Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement. And then the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's changed and what has not changed with regard to race in the 50 or so years, 55 years since Martin Luther King's assassination, and why things are the way they are today, or at least partly why they are the way today. So in the first point, I want to talk precisely about the ways in which Brown versus Board of Education contributed to the civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s. Brown, of course, barred state-mandated segregation in education And then we got these landmark civil rights statutes, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which bars discrimination in public accommodations and employment, imposes anti-discrimination rules on entities that receive federal funding. And then we get the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which is what really turned the South into a democracy for the first time since Reconstruction. Contrary to the conventional wisdom, I'm going to focus on Brown's contribution to radicalizing Southern whites, bolstering their resistance to progressive racial change, and ultimately leading to violent resistance to the civil rights movement. The claim is that when that violence erupted in places like Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, and Selma, Alabama in 1965, that led to the civil rights legislation being enacted, but it was actually Brown that in some ways ensured that those civil rights demonstrators would be confronted with violence. So I want to start by talking about a few ways in which Southern race relations clearly regressed after Brown. One of these was the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, which had actually been on the decline before Brown, but then got rejuvenated after Brown. Another kind of retrogression was the South's aggressive legal assault on the NAACP after the Brown decision. Before Brown, it's not like white Southerners had loved the NAACP, but they found it a minor irritant. And after Brown, they found it an object of consuming hatred. The association's Southern membership, which had grown significantly during and after World War II, took a nosedive after Brown when it became too dangerous to be affiliated. In addition, with Southern school desegregation now lurking in the background, it became much more difficult for African Americans to register to vote in the South. Voting was now intolerable with school desegregation lurking in the background. And that backlash also reversed progress that had been underway in the South, even in the Deep South, with regard to integrated sporting competitions like minor league baseball games and college football games. Brown had another, possibly more important effect in the South, which is that it directly led to white on black violence, which was often then broadcast to national audiences. Virtually every year after Brown, school desegregation, which took place in different places at different times, led to some sort of violence, church bombings, school bombings, etc. These violent confrontations over school desegregation tended to show Black people at their best and whites at their worst. The few African Americans who had been handpicked as school desegregation pioneers tended to be bright, well-mannered, and nonviolent, while the mobs that were confronting them tended to be vicious and profane. Media coverage of these confrontations, according to a New York Post editorial, revealed, quote, quiet, resolute Negro children defying jeers and violence and sadism. To the extent that many Americans were forming their opinions about race issues and school desegregation specifically from these televised confrontations, it was a pretty good bet that whites were doomed to lose the battle over public opinion. Brown also radicalized Southern politics and increased the likelihood that when direct action protests like sit-in demonstrations erupted, they would be confronted with violence. Political contests in Southern states assumed a common pattern in the post-Brown period. Moderation became a term of derision, maybe not so different from today in some senses. Critics of massive resistance were denounced as traitors and cowards, and moderate politicians were forced to join the segregationist bandwagon or else they were retired from public service. Before Brown, racial moderates actually had largely controlled Southern politics. These politicians were economically populist, and while of course they were segregationists, any successful politician in the South was a segregationist before Brown or Board of Education, they actually tended to downplay race while accommodating gradual racial reform. For example, some of you may remember Folksy Jim Folsom in Alabama had won gubernatorial elections in the mid-1940s and early 1950s on populist platforms of expanded public services, abolition of the poll tax, and legislative reapportionment. With regard to race, specifically, Folsom urged, quote, fellowship and brotherly love, and he declared that African Americans were entitled to their fair share of public services. As governor, he appointed voting registrars to fairly administer voting requirements, and he supported equalizing the salaries of African American teachers. When pressed during the 1954 gubernatorial campaign for his views on Brown, which had literally just been decided, Brown was May 17, 1954, and the Democratic primary for governor in Alabama was just a week later. Folsom joked that, quote, I don't intend to make the good colored folks of Alabama go to school with us white folks. That year, he easily defeated a candidate who emphasized the importance of preserving white supremacy. Big Jim Folsom was destroyed in the post-Brown racial hysteria. He had refused to join other Southern governors in a statement condemning Brown, and he had vetoed several pieces of massive resistance legislation that had been passed by the Alabama legislature. By the fall of 1955, state legislators and the citizens' councils, which were white supremacist organizations committed to preserving segregation by all means short of violence, they were now denouncing the governor. Folsom tried to move to the right to protect his flank. By early 1956, for the very first time, he was declaring his support for preserving segregation. And in 1957, he actually signed a nullification resolution purporting to nullify the Supreme Court's decision in Brown. But it was too little too late. In Alabama's 1958 gubernatorial primary, all of the candidates repudiated Folsom's racial moderation and touted their segregationist credentials. It was a competition to see who could move furthest to the right on preserving white supremacy. George Wallace was one of the candidates. He bragged that as a state circuit judge, he had threatened to arrest FBI agents if they came into his county seeking access to jury selection records to verify charges of race discrimination in jury selection. He also promised that he would close the schools rather than see them integrated. His principal opponent in 1958 was the state attorney general. I don't know if any of you remember the name, John Patterson. He actually just passed away at the age of 99 a couple of years ago. Patterson's principal claim to fame was that he had shut down the NAACP in the state of Alabama. The Ku Klux Klan endorsed Patterson, whom Wallace then gently criticized for refusing to repudiate the endorsement. That made Wallace unwittingly the candidate of moderation. Those blacks who were registered to vote in Alabama, which was very few blacks, they voted for George Wallace, and Wallace was easily defeated in the runoff primary, and that left him to ruminate that, quote, they out-Negroed me that time. That's a euphemism. They will never do it again. In 1962, he made good on that promise, vowing that he would defy any integration order, quote, even to the point of standing in the schoolhouse door. He won easily, pulling more votes than anyone in Alabama history. In his inaugural address in January 1963, Wallace reaffirmed his defiant stand, quote, in the name of the greatest people that ever trod the earth, as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That was typical of Southern racial politics in the wake of Brown. Now, in addition to radicalizing politics, Brown may have directly fostered white-on-black violence. Polls revealed that 15 to 25% of respondents, Southern whites, favored violence if necessary to resist desegregation. There's similar polls today about violence to save the nation if it goes further down the wrong track. Most Southern politicians avoided explicit exhortations to violence, but the extremist rhetoric they used to condemn Brown almost surely contributed to it. A speech by Congressman James Davis of Georgia, I can give you other examples, was typical. He insisted, quote, there is no place for violence or lawless activity, but that was only after he said Brown was, quote, a monumental fraud, which is shocking, outrageous, and reprehensible, close quote. And he warned against, quote, meekly accepting this brazen usurpation of power. Such denunciations became even harsher, if that's believable, after President Eisenhower sent federal troops into Central High School in Little Rock in September of 1957. Southern politicians now compared President Eisenhower to Hitler, and they compared the use of federal troops in the South to the Soviet invasion of Hungary the preceding year. These politicians either knew or were criminally negligent for not knowing that their words were likely to inspire violence. The linkage between particular public officials and the violence that erupted and led to the civil rights legislation is, I think, quite compelling. Bull Connor had been Birmingham's police chief all the way back to the late 1930s. The Commissioner of Public Safety was the formal title. Local leaders in the early 50s, civic and political leaders, had orchestrated a sexual encounter between Connor and somebody else in a local hotel, and that had enabled them to remove him from office about 1951, 1952. And with his removal from office, some progress occurred in Birmingham with regard to race. For example, the establishment of the first Black hospital in the city. After Brown, that racial progress in Birmingham ground to a halt, and Connor made a political comeback. In 1957, he defeated an incumbent who he attacked as soft on segregation. Standing for re-election in 1961, Connor cultivated extremists by offering the Ku Klux Klan 15 minutes of open season on the Freedom Riders as they rolled into town, meaning he gave them 15 minutes in which they could beat the Freedom Riders while the police were conveniently absent. Birmingham rewarded that action with a landslide victory at the polls. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. brought the Southern Christian Leadership Conference campaign to Birmingham, partly because Bull Connor was there and they expected that he would be unable to control himself in the face of protesting African Americans and would use violence. That campaign worked out pretty much as planned, as Connor, after some uncharacteristic restraint, eventually unleashed the police dogs and the fire hoses who attacked demonstrators, many of whom by that point were children. National media featured images of police dogs attacking non-resisting demonstrators, including a famous one that President John F. Kennedy reported made him sick. Newspaper editorials condemned the violence as a national disgrace, and citizens voiced their outrage and demanded legislative action in response. The Birmingham demonstrations dramatically altered public opinion on race. Before Birmingham, only 4% of respondents reported that civil rights was the nation's most important issues. That 4% became 52% after the Birmingham demonstrations. It was only after Birmingham that President Kennedy went on national television to announce that civil rights was, quote, a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. It was Birmingham that directly enabled the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. More than any other single Southern politician, George Wallace personified the post-Brown racial fanaticism of Southern politics. In June 1963, he fulfilled his campaign pledge by physically blocking the desegregation of the University of Alabama. In September, he used state troops to block efforts to desegregate 5 different schools in cities throughout the state, and he urged extremists to wage a boisterous campaign against desegregation in Birmingham. Threatened with judicial contempt citations by all of the federal judges in Alabama, Wallace eventually relented. The schools desegregated, but within a week, tragedy had struck as the Ku Klux Klan dynamited the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 young Black schoolgirls. Most of the nation was appalled by the murder of innocent 13 and 14-year-old school children. Northern whites wrote to the NAACP to join the organization, to condemn the violence, and to apologize. A white lawyer from Los Angeles wrote that, quote, "Today I am joining the NAACP, partly I think as a kind of apology for being Caucasian and for not being in Birmingham to lend my physical support," end quote. A Black veteran of World War I from South Carolina who had, quote, "seen many things that have been irksome," close quote, indeed, in his 70 years, including the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955 and the murder of Medgar Evers in 1963. He wrote to the NAACP to say that, quote, "Nothing in my life has had this effect upon me that the bombing of the church and the murder of the Negroes in Birmingham had," close quote. He prayed that God would not, quote, "let these children die in vain," end quote. Across America, tens of thousands of Americans marched to protest and attended memorial services. Northern congressmen, now reflecting the anger of their constituents, introduced amendments to the administration's pending civil rights bill to make it more robust. Early in 1965, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference brought its voter registration campaign to Selma, Alabama, a site that was chosen partly because of the presence there of another law enforcement officer of Bull Connor-like proclivities. That was the sheriff of Dallas County, the county that surrounds Selma, a man named Jim Clark. This was another resounding success for the movement, albeit a tragic one. People lost their lives as a result of the Selma campaign. Clark's brutalization of non-resisting demonstrators, including, of course, later Congressman John Lewis, who had his skull busted on the end of Pettus Bridge, culminated in Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, when law enforcement officers violently attacked marchers as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the way to Montgomery. Governor Wallace had promised that the march would be broken up by whatever means were necessary. That evening, the television networks interrupted their broadcasts, including, ironically, I think NBC was showing Judgment at Nuremberg. They interrupted their program for reports of peaceful demonstrators being attacked by police officers on horses with flailing billy clubs. Most of the country was repulsed. Sympathy demonstrations took place across the United States, and citizens demanded remedial action from their congressional representatives. 1 week later, President Johnson went before a joint session of Congress to demand the passage of voting rights legislation. 70 million Americans watched. You'll recall this was before cable. People didn't have a lot of options. 70 million Americans watched their president beseech them to, quote, "overcome this crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice," close quote, and declared his faith that, quote, "we shall overcome," close quote. So to sum up the first part of my argument, Brown brought racial conflict in the South to a climax earlier than might otherwise have happened. It radicalized white Southerners, and it surfaced the violence that had always lay at the core of white supremacy. The beating of peaceful demonstrators by Southern law enforcement officers repulsed national opinion and led quite directly to the enactment of landmark civil rights legislation. Now, I'm going to begin the second part of my talk by quickly noting some of the ways in which we've made dramatic progress on racial equality since the mid-1960s and some of the ways we have not. And then I'll talk a little bit about why we haven't made more progress, and also a little bit about what's going on in our politics today, which I don't assume everybody will agree with. In 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was enacted, nobody would have dreamed that the United States anytime in the next century would have an African-American president, which of course we did have from 2009 to 2017, and in my estimation, actually quite a terrific president. In 1965, there were fewer than 5 African Americans serving in Congress. Today, there are more than 60. Before the Voting Rights Act, about 6% of the adult population of African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. Within 4 years, that number was up to 60%. As of 1965, there had never been in the history of the nation a Black Supreme Court justice. There's been one consistently since 1967, and of course there are 2 on the Supreme Court today. There were 2 African-American federal court judges serving in 1965. Today there are about 85. In the year 1965, fewer than 100 African-Americans graduated from accredited law schools in the nation. In 2020, that number was about 2,800. In 1965, not a single Black person had ever been the head coach of an NBA team, an NFL team, a Major League Baseball team. Today, last time I checked, exactly half of the head coaches in the NBA are African American. The NFL and Major League Baseball have not done quite as well. Those are all dramatic changes, welcome changes, and nobody ought to deny the fact of those changes. Yet all of the following facts are also true today. Black families today, on average, control little more than 10% of the wealth of white families. Black unemployment rate is twice that of whites. A recent study, this was in the New York Times within the last couple of days, found that Black women in New York City are 9 times as likely as whites to die in childbirth. On average, African Americans lost 3 to 4 times as many years on life expectancy during COVID as whites. The United States today incarcerates more people per capita than any nation in the world, more than 5 times as many in 1970. Over 37% of those incarcerated are African American, when African Americans make up about 13% of the general population. 1/3 of Black males born today can expect to be incarcerated at some point in their lives. That is 17 times the incarceration rate for whites born today. In Florida and Georgia, nearly 1/3 of African American men are disenfranchised because of prior felony conviction. Blacks are more than 3 times as likely to be killed in encounters with whites than whites with encounters with police officers. What needed to happen in the mid-1960s, in my opinion, in addition to the enactment of landmark civil rights legislation, was a massive federal government program in the inner cities. Building decent housing, improving educational opportunities, creating jobs for African Americans who had moved to those cities quite recently from the South in pursuit of job opportunities that were starting to disappear due to globalization, due to technological change, and due to the flight of whites to suburbs, as well as jobs to suburbs. where African Americans were quite literally not allowed to follow. President Lyndon Johnson was actually contemplating precisely this sort of domestic Marshall Plan as part of his war on poverty, but a combination of factors, the escalating war in Vietnam, rising crime rates, and urban uprisings by a desperate and angry Black working class derailed such a program. But something else critical was happening in the mid-1960s, which continues to exert its influence today, and that is what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk, and that is a dramatic shift in the politics of race. One of the transformative events in the modern American political history of race was Senator Barry Goldwater's defeat of Governor Nelson Rockefeller in the 1964 Republican presidential primary. For the 30 or so years before 1964, African Americans had cast roughly 30 to 40% of their votes for Republican presidential nominees. But from 1964 to the present, Republican presidential nominees have rarely won more than 10% of the African American vote. Goldwater, a conservative senator from Arizona, was one of only 6 Republican senators who opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that year. Senator Goldwater was a libertarian. He believed that government should not tell people who they had to have in their restaurant or who they had to employ, even if they were engaging in race discrimination. Few Black delegates attended the Republican Party convention in 1964, and Jackie Robinson, the baseball great, who did attend the convention, he was still a Republican in 1964, he said afterward with regard to the convention's racial climate, quote, "I now believe I know how it felt to be a Jew in Hitler's Germany." The few Black delegates literally were spit upon and denounced and insulted to their faces. The 1964 presidential election, Black voters had little difficulty figuring out whether to support Goldwater, who campaigned in the South side by side with the white supremacist South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, or to support President Lyndon Johnson, who had declared within a week of President John F. Kennedy's assassination that there could be, quote, "no memorial oration or eulogy that could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long," close quote. Over 90% of Black voters supported Johnson, who won a landslide. Barry Goldwater won only his home state and 5 states in the Deep South, where African Americans were still overwhelmingly disenfranchised and where whites deserted President Johnson and the Democratic Party in droves. Although, this is not widely known, although congressional Republicans actually supported the 1965 Civil Rights Act in larger proportions than congressional Democrats, and Southern Democratic senators collectively conducted the longest filibuster in the nation's history against the statute, Democrats nonetheless received most of the credit for the law's enactment because they controlled the national government when it was passed, and because Goldwater had been such a prominent opponent. Upon the law's enactment, President Johnson presciently reflected, quote, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." The Voting Rights Act was passed the following year. It quickly turned the South into something resembling a democracy for the first time since Reconstruction. And as I've noted, thereafter, Republican candidates rarely won as much as 10% of the Black vote at the presidential level. By contrast, Southern whites who before 1964 had been among the most loyal Democratic voting blocs in the nation, they gradually but inexorably gravitated toward the Republican Party. Today, more than 70% of Southern whites vote Republican, and in Mississippi, that number is roughly 90%. President Obama won less than 10% of the white vote in Mississippi. Senator Thurmond of South Carolina, a politician who had run for president on a Dixiecrat platform of open embrace of white supremacy in 1948, in 1957, had conducted the longest solo filibuster against civil rights legislation in American history, and in 1964 had become the first of the prominent Southern Democrats to switch parties. He took over much of the Republican Party apparatus in the South after Goldwater's defeat. In 1966, not a single Black delegate attended the South Carolina Republican Convention, which took place under an enormous Confederate flag. The Los Angeles Times wrote, quote, "The party of Lincoln has become the party of the white man in much of Dixie." As a Republican presidential candidate in 1968, Richard Nixon made a deal with Senator Thurmond to consummate the party's hold on Southern whites. To help ensure the South Carolinian support, President Nixon promised he would oppose court-ordered busing to integrate the schools and promised to name a strict constructionist justice to the Supreme Court. Nixon also campaigned heavily on a law and order platform, which implicitly condemned the urban racial uprisings that most of the nation experienced between 1965 and 1968, as African Americans living in some of the nation's worst ghetto conditions exploded with rage and resentment to the great consternation of many whites. With the segregationist Wallace running to Nixon's right flank as an independent candidate, you may remember Wallace won 13% of the popular vote, although polling had showed him much of the campaign at more like 20 or 25%. With Wallace running on Nixon's right flank and Nixon campaigning on thinly disguised racial themes, the two of them won a combined 70% of the Southern white vote. Nixon won just 12% of the African American vote across the country, compared to the 32% he had won in 1960, campaigning as a very different sort of Republican. Soon after Nixon was elected president, his administration tried to force a slowdown in court-ordered school desegregation in the South and put a conservative white Southerner on the Supreme Court. Ever since Nixon's successful Southern strategy in 1968, Republican politicians at the national level have appealed to racial resentment with not so subtle appeals on issues such as crime, welfare, and race-based affirmative action. Through the 1970s and 1980s, white voters across the nation, but especially in the South, began increasingly to identify as Republicans. In 1980, of course, the Republican Party nominated Ronald Reagan for the presidency, and the conversion of Southern whites from Democrats into Republicans continued apace. In 1972, this is an incredible statistic I did not know 10 years ago. In 1972, Southern whites who self-identified as conservative favored the Democratic Party by 5 percentage points. In 1988, 16 years later, they favored the Republican Party by a margin of 41 percentage points. Reagan had achieved national prominence, as some of you may remember, by giving a primetime speech supporting Goldwater's candidacy in 1964, and then he was elected. I watched that recently on YouTube. You can see the appeal of Ronald Reagan. He's a funny guy, very articulate, and he gave a primetime event that put him on the political radar screen. In addition, when he ran for governor of California and won in 1966, it was part of a backlash against the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965 and against the radical student protests at Berkeley in the preceding years. As his party's presidential nominee in 1980, Ronald Reagan, I'll bet most of you didn't know this, but I think most African Americans of age could tell you this. He kicked off his general election campaign at a fair in Neshoba County, Mississippi, which is where the 3 white workers were murdered during Freedom Summer in 1964. Before an almost entirely white audience, Reagan, who had opposed the 1960 civil rights legislation, defended states' rights, which of course was a traditional rallying cry of Southern segregationists. Following his victory, his administration challenged the constitutionality of race-based affirmative action, opposed busing to integrate schools, resisted reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, and laxly enforced it once it was reauthorized, and initially vowed to oppose the Internal Revenue Service's policy of ending tax-exempt status for institutions that receive federal funding, but insisted on segregating themselves. In 1986, Ronald Reagan promoted to the Chief Justiceship William Rehnquist, a man who had probably lied to Congress in 1971 during his confirmation hearings when he denied having harassed minority voters in Phoenix, Arizona in the early 1960s, and also a man who had argued while he was clerking on the Supreme Court in 1952, 1953, that Plessy versus Ferguson ought to be reaffirmed and racial segregation upheld as constitutional. In 1987, Ronald Reagan nominated to the Supreme Court Robert Bork, who had opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act as representing, quote, a principle of unsurpassed ugliness, and it also questioned the constitutionality of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In 1994, the Republican Party won control of the House of Representatives for the first time, literally in 40 years, and won a majority of Southern House seats for the first time since Reconstruction. In that year's Southern congressional elections, Democrats won 91% of African American votes, but their share of the white vote was now down to 35%. Southerners now form the largest bloc of House Republicans, and over the following 20 years, Republicans who in 1988 did not control a single Southern state legislature seized control of every state legislature in the states of the former Confederacy. Over the course of one generation, or maybe a generation and a half, white Southerners had gone from being the Democratic Party's most loyal supporters to dominating the Republican Party. The Republican Party of the 1990s, however, did not make it harder to vote and certainly would not have supported repeal of the Voting Rights Act or judicial invalidation of it. Something changed. What has changed in the last 30 years to lead today's GOP and its judicial appointees to sanction widespread efforts to make it more difficult to vote and to gut the Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court did in 2013. One of the most dramatic changes taking place in the United States in the last 30 years is demographic change. Most of that has happened since 1980, 1990. Higher birth rates among people of color and dramatically increased immigration, mostly from Latin America and from Asia, have increased the proportion of the population that is non-white. These are stunning numbers. Whites were 90% of the US population, according to the 1950 census, 80% of the US population, according to the 1990 census, and a little bit less than 60% of the US population in 2020. And according to demographers, sometime in the early 2040s, the United States will no longer be majority white. As one demographer has observed, quote, "No other country has ever experienced such dramatic racial and ethnic change." Signs of these demographic shifts are everywhere. They're on the streets of the nation, in sporting events, on television, and indeed in the form of the nation's first biracial president, beginning in 2009. To many Americans, probably not most Americans, but to many Americans, these changes have been disturbing. Throughout American history, large-scale immigration that alters the ethnic or racial or religious composition of the electorate. I probably don't need to tell most of you that about Irish Catholic immigration in New England in the 1840s, which led to a party called the Know Nothings taking over the Massachusetts legislature in the 1850s. Those sorts of changes have often generated political and social backlash. Over the last 3 decades, the two major political parties have become increasingly divided along lines of race and ethnicity and attitudes toward race and ethnicity, as well as, of course, over lots of other issues as well. In the 1980s, white Democrats and Republicans did not differ much in levels of racial resentment as measured by political scientists, and Democrats and Republicans did not hold dramatically different views on immigration-related legislation. That's in the 1980s. Since then, however, racially conservative whites have flocked to the Republican Party. Today, very negative views about illegal immigration strongly predict support for the Republican Party. At the same time, people of color have become overwhelmingly likely to vote Democratic. Between 1992 and 2012, just over 20 years, the non-white share of Democratic voters increased from 21 to 42%. In 2012, President Obama won 71% of the Latino vote, 73% of the Asian American vote, and 93% of the African American vote. More than 40% of the current Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives consists of people of color, only 5% of the Republican caucus. Now, some of that shift is attributable to cultural and economic factors, but scholars have shown, I think quite persuasively, that racial considerations have been the predominant factor, and that many whites feel increasingly resentful about their perceived loss of social status in a diversified society. Social scientists distinguish between old-fashioned racism, a belief in white supremacy, and something they call racial resentment. They measure that by asking questions like, do you think that Black people or white people suffer more today from racial discrimination? Or another question would be, do you think the reason why African Americans have not achieved full equality is because of the nation's history of slavery and Jim Crow, or because African Americans have not worked hard enough? While white supremacist beliefs have hardly disappeared, and indeed you can find white supremacists crawling out from beneath the rocks increasingly over the last 10 years, racial resentment is clearly the more important factor today. Between 1980 and 2010, racial resentment among white voters increased significantly, but only among Republican identified voters, with the share of white Republicans who scored at the high end of the racial resentment scale rising from 44% to 64%. Changing racial demographics owing to large-scale immigration have compounded the resentment that many whites felt as a result of the growing influence of African Americans within the Democratic Party. Joe Biden would not be president today if it were not for the fact that African Americans are a majority of the constituents in the Democratic primary in South Carolina, which is what put Joe Biden on the path to nomination after losing New Hampshire and Iowa in 2020. As demographic change and media narratives of threat imposed by immigrants set the stage for white backlash, ambitious and unscrupulous politicians have capitalized on the opportunity for political gain in the same way George Wallace brilliantly but reprehensibly capitalized on it in the 1960s. In the 1990s, former Nixon speechwriter Pat Buchanan ran twice for the Republican presidential nomination, and he won several primaries in 1996, including, you may recall, in New Hampshire. His platform was very similar to that of Donald Trump in 2016, including opposing immigrant invasion, proposing a wall on the Mexican border, criticizing free trade agreements. Whites who scored high on measures of racial resentment voted disproportionately for Buchanan. Then Senator Barack Obama would not have been nominated in 2008 by the Democratic Party as it was constituted in 1992. He could not have been elected president in 2008. It was only because the non-white share of the electorate had doubled since then, from 13% in 1992 to 26%, and because Latino Americans and Asian Americans had switched in large numbers to the Democratic Party. Obama lost white voters to Senator John McCain in 2008 by 12 percentage points, even though he won the popular vote by 7 points. And that's because he won 3/4 of Latino, Asian American, and Black voters. While many pundits treated Obama's election as the dawn of a post-racial era, in fact, racial resentment among white voters strongly correlated, even in the Democratic primary in 2008, among those racially resentful whites still voting in the Democratic primary. That is, those whites voted for Hillary Clinton rather than Barack Obama. In the general election, Obama would have won by an even larger margin had racially resentful whites who typically voted Democratic not shifted sides. Attitude toward race increasingly shaped attitudes on various policy issues during Obama's presidency, issues having nothing to do with race. Perceptions of the state of the economy began to correlate during Obama's presidency based on race, as did views on healthcare, or even on favorable opinions about the Obama dogs. Even though during his first term, Obama explicitly discussed race less than any prior president than FDR during his first term. President Obama would not have been reelected in 2012 without the strong support of non-white voters. His share of the white vote declined. He won 43% of the white vote in 2008. He won 39% in 2012. Romney won the white vote by 20 percentage points, yet Obama nonetheless managed to win re-election by 4 points, and that's because he turned out unprecedented numbers of Black voters. There are actually states in the Deep South, for the first and only time in their history, had larger Black turnout rates than white for Obama in 2012, and because he won unprecedented margins among Latino and Asian Americans. A post-election postmortem, an election postmortem commissioned by the Republican National Committee, concluded that the party had to increase its support among Latino voters, including by supporting comprehensive immigration reform legislation. Republicans in the House blocked a version that had been approved by the Senate. The Republicans dominated by the Tea Party caucus, and the following year, Republican candidates generally ignored the post-mortem report and nonetheless scored huge victories. Donald Trump was paying attention. During his campaign for the presidency in 2006, Trump retweeted false assertions from white supremacists, including the allegation that a majority of white homicide victims had been killed by African Americans. Not true. And he only reluctantly repudiated an endorsement from the white supremacist and former Klan leader, David Duke. Trump eventually made his campaign manager the leader of the white nationalist alt-right, Steve Bannon. High racial resentment among the Republican primaries correlated more strongly than any other factor with support for Trump. 72% of registered Republican voters in 2016 still profess belief that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, and Trump, of course, had been the most aggressive, most boisterous of the birther lie conspiracies. By 2016, differences between the racial resentment scores of the two parties' voters had never been greater. The share of the white voters with high racial resentment had dropped significantly during Obama's presidency, while that of Republicans had increased. White working class voters proved critical, meaning whites without a college degree, had proved critical to Trump's election. While Romney and Trump both won by about the same 20 percentage points among whites, it was actually a very different subgroup of whites. Trump performed much better among white working class men, and he did much worse among college-educated whites. Why did Trump prove so appealing to these voters? In the aftermath of the election, many pundits focused on voters' economic concerns and anxiety about the state of the economy. Trump had opposed free trade agreements, and he had promised to bring back manufacturing and mining jobs. Yet the evidence, as sorted by political scientists, actually supports better the hypothesis that racial resentment, not exclusively, but more than other factors, drove Trump's success for the white working class. Higher education, as you probably know, correlates strongly with lower racial resentment and prejudice. College exposes people to new ideas and different cultures, and better educated people are less likely to see different racial groups as being engaged in a battle against each other in a zero-sum competition. With regard to race, Trump covered much as he campaigned. His cabinet included more white men than any president since Ronald Reagan. With regard to immigration, President Trump imposed a ban on travel from several majority Muslim nations. He used an emergency declaration as a pretext to divert funding to build a wall on the Mexican border. He separated parents from young children in order to deter illegal immigration, and he expelled hundreds of thousands of refugees who were in the United States under temporary protected status. Heading into the 2018 midterms, Trump promised that he would end birthright citizenship, even though it's in the Constitution. You obviously can't terminate it by executive order. Trump's Justice Department essentially ended the pursuit of consent decrees against police departments who have been shown to have engaged in patterns and practices of racially discriminatory policing. Trump's 2020 re-election campaign stoked racial resentment at every turn. It was no accident the site that was chosen for his first rally after the pandemic had disrupted the campaign was Tulsa, Oklahoma, where one of the nation's worst racial white-on-black massacres had occurred in 1921, when they literally burned down one of the most successful Black business districts in American history and killed perhaps as many as a couple hundred African Americans. Trump also, during the campaign, I'm almost over, I promise, called a Black Lives Matter sign a symbol of hate. He labeled racial justice protesters anarchists. He defended statues of Confederate war heroes, and he told Americans, quote, living their suburban lifestyle dreams, close quote, that he would protect them from, quote, having low-income housing built in their neighborhoods. He might have written in the word Black and Latino. Now, I'm sure most of us do not perceive there to be much open support for white supremacy anymore. And of course, that is a very good thing. Again, Strom Thurmond literally ran for president in 1948 on a campaign of white supremacy, and he won the electoral votes of 4 southern states. But it is hard to make progress with regard to full racial equality when racial resentment remains such an important part of our current political dynamics. And for the last 50 years, it has been crucial to the electoral strategy of one of our main political parties. So I want to spend just a couple of my last few moments illustrating this by telling you some things that are true about contemporary politics, but that you might not be aware of, or that might fly under the surface, and so you don't see the subtle racial dog whistling. Every state under GOP political control, and that of course includes New Hampshire, has made it harder to vote over the last 15 years, which is directed at disfranchising poor people, young people, and people of color. Almost every state under GOP political control has forbade teaching critical race theory in public schools, even though, as far as I can tell, almost no schools teach critical race theory. In several states, including Florida, whose governor has made stoking racial resentment a key part of his campaign for the Republican Party's presidential nomination, public school teachers now are constrained severely in their ability to teach facts about America's racial history. In Texas, the Republican governor has promised to pardon a man convicted by a Texas jury of murdering a Black Lives Matter protester. Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott, when he announced an 11-point program for the Republican Party heading into the 2022 off-year elections, made the top 2 planks in his program about race: ending affirmative action and abolishing critical race theory. This is also why Nikki Haley, as I'm sure you observed in the last 2 weeks, could not give a straightforward answer as to what caused the Civil War. She knows too many Republican primary voters do not want to hear about slavery, which is also why Governor DeSantis wants Florida schools to teach school children that African Americans learned many valuable skills while enslaved. Now, none of this is an accident. This is the 2024 version of Richard Nixon running for president on a platform of law and order and strict construction, and the 1980 version of Ronald Reagan launching his campaign in Neshoba County and deriding Black welfare queens. Racial resentment remains a powerful force in American politics today. That is a large part of why Martin Luther King would be disappointed not to have seen more racial progress. So I appreciate your patience. I'm honored by the invitation. I know many of you will have questions, and I look forward to it. Yeah, sir.
How much credit do you give Lyndon Johnson for the 64 Civil Rights Act? Or was it because of Kennedy bringing it to the forefront by bringing in the military and it was politically expedient for him to do it?
Historians and biographers disagree. I think it's hard to know for sure. The president's assassination and Lyndon Johnson's very clever statement 6 days after that there is no more better memorial to the slain president than passing the Civil Rights Bill. That was helpful, but it was filibustered by the longest filibuster in history. It probably matters that Lyndon Johnson was one of the shrewdest political operators that we've ever had. And Lyndon Johnson, who in the past had opposed, he was elected to Congress in Texas in a special election in 1937. He opposed anti-lynching legislation, anti-poll tax legislation, just like most other Southern congressmen. He decided at some point that he was going to make civil rights his issue. So I'm not a huge fan. I don't know if I can say this in New Hampshire, or not next. I'm not a huge fan of the Kennedys. I am a very big fan of Lyndon Johnson. The Vietnam War was terrible, I think. I think it was a mistake. I think that's probably what most Americans think today. But I'm not convinced that President Kennedy would have done anything different in Vietnam than what Johnson did. I don't know whether the Civil Rights Bill would have passed. It would not have been proposed before Birmingham. The Kennedy administration was moving slowly on civil rights. Black leaders were increasingly vocal in their criticism of the administration. As early as the early part of 1963, there was no plan to introduce civil rights legislation. Birmingham forced the hand of the administration. The bill the administration proposed was much milder than civil rights leaders wanted. There was much criticism of their bill. Then we had the March on Washington, which the administration had tried to shut down. Then we had the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Those things led directly to more aggressive amendments to the bill. Then the president was assassinated, which made the South look bad because he was assassinated in Dallas, and because school children in Alabama and Mississippi were heard to literally applaud at the news that the president was. So there was a lot of stuff going on, but the bill wasn't inevitably going to pass because it was the longest filibuster in history, and nobody in the spring knew if it would pass. So I'm inclined to give Lyndon Johnson credit, but the problem with history is you can't do a social science experiment where you control for variables. What we want to do is run the whole thing again without Kennedy's assassination. You can't do that. So I think that Lyndon Johnson gets a lot of credit, and he said this will kill the Democratic Party in the South, but he didn't do anything. So I give him a lot of credit, but I don't think we can know the answer.
It's a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Just bottom line, in your gut, how do you feel about 2024? And how are you worried?
Yeah. I think everybody I know everybody is worried to death. I mean, there's more likelihood of political violence than at any time since the Civil War. I think most political scientists think that. Many of you have read Ziblatt and Levitsky. They wrote a book 4 years ago called How Democracies Die. They have a more alarming book written, published in the fall of 2023. I think it's called Minority Tyranny. They both at Harvard. I'm friendly with them. I talk to them. But most political scientists I know, if you listen to Ezra Klein, there's a terrific podcast. His last podcast with David French, who's a New York Times opinion columnist. David French is an evangelical Christian, lives in Tennessee. He lives among people, they're his friends and neighbors, and he said he's never seen people as upset, as angry, as likely to engage in violence. He thinks this is something, he doesn't even recognize people as recently as 2016. They're more angry, they're more convinced that Trump is being persecuted by the federal government. They're more convinced that Joe Biden is manipulating the federal government to go after his political enemies, that Biden and the international Jews are conspiring in this replacement effort to invade the country with people who allow both of them. There is a significant chance, and a third of Republican voters say to pollsters that the country may be so off track that it will be necessary for true patriots to use violence. Now, I feel like we're watching this happen and we don't know what you can do about it, because right now there is no good solution. So if you don't listen to the whole podcast, listen to the last 15 minutes. Most of, you can get anywhere you want to listen to it. The last 15 minutes, most of the podcast is about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and whether Trump should be disqualified from the ballot. And I can talk to you about that if you're curious, but there is no good solution. So David French is arguing quite aggressively. He's a lawyer in Harvard Law School. He's arguing quite aggressively the Supreme Court should affirm the Colorado Supreme Court and keep Trump off the ballot. That is not my intuition, even though I'm strongly opposed to Trump. I sort of think that that something would need to be worked out. Or you guys have never. I was not initially persuaded by this, and I'm probably still not persuaded by it, but he points out there is no good solution now. So if you think kicking Trump off the ballot will make his voters go crazy and use violence, that might be true, but Trump losing the election also might lead to violence, because it did. And here's the key point that I don't think I had thought enough. If you think you might have violence, you like Joe Biden to be the one in charge of the military. Oh, and this may be, with the aid of hindsight, your last best possibility. And if you look down the road 2 years and Trump decides to become what he almost surely will be, which is a authoritarian inclined president. And I'm not an alarmist. I don't think the United States is going to turn into an autocracy. That doesn't happen overnight. But there will be a clear, gradual erosion of democratic norms. So Trump will use the Justice Department to prosecute enemies. He's already said, with the help of the Heritage Foundation, he's going to kick out of office 50,000 civil servants. There are a lot of things you can do, including, they said they're going to prosecute the media that doesn't agree with them. So this could, in retrospect, be your last best opportunity. I'm not there yet. I don't think that you can. Here's the reason why. It is actually an interesting case. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is actually pretty clear. The way I teach constitutional law is there are kind of legal elements to judicial decision making, and then there are quote unquote political elements. The political elements are things like, what are the judge's ideology? What are the judge's political meetings? What is the external political pressure on the court? Just to give you a simple example, it's no accident that all the justices who don't think abortion should be a right are also the justices who don't find it in the Constitution, right? The 6 Republican justices do not think well of a woman's right to abortion, and they also think the Constitution doesn't protect it. And the 3 liberal justices think a woman should have a right to choose, and it's in the Constitution. And the same thing's true about gun control, and the same thing's true about affirmative action, and the same thing's true about campaign finance reform. It's not some accident that they happen to rule in favor constitutionally their policy views. It's because constitutional interpretation has a very substantial dose of politics, and we can talk about why. But the legal sources, the text, the original understanding of the text, judicial precedent, those are actually really clear. The Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says, if you engaged in insurrection, you shall not hold executive office if you previously took an oath of office and breached that oath. Well, Trump clearly took an oath, and he's seeking an executive office. Now, some people will say, well, Section 3 isn't self-enforcing. You have to pass a statute. It doesn't say that. And Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, the Home Equal Protection Clause, clearly is self-enforcing. You don't need a statute to enforce Section 1. So that's a bad argument. So the only argument would be, well, Trump didn't engage in insurrection. Those are 2 separate points. Is what happened on January 2nd insurrection, and did Trump engage in it? Now, on both of those, there's a pretty good argument, but I don't think a knockdown argument that he did. If you look at the dictionary definition of insurrection in 1866, when they wrote this, there's a pretty good argument that a violent assault on the Capitol, trying to prevent them from implementing a peaceful transition of power, that counts as an insurrection. Did Trump engage in it? Well, he's charged with a wide-ranging conspiracy, calling up the Secretary of State of Georgia, saying, find me some votes, calling up electors, fake electors, trying to submit them, trying to dun Mike Pence into not counting the votes, and he gave an inciting speech that might actually make him criminally liable as a post-First Amendment question. So there's a pretty good argument, but not a knockdown argument engaged in insurrection. So, and remember, these are justices who only care about text and original understanding. So maybe they should disqualify him, but I will say to you here, and I could be wrong, I've been wrong many times, I think there is zero chance they'll disqualify him, and I would not be surprised if it's unanimous decision, because I don't think the Supreme Court wants to risk its legitimacy by getting half the country up in arms, and I think we all kind of discount the future. So the Supreme Court decision can come down in 3 weeks. What do you think would happen? I mean, I have no idea. I hope I'm wrong, but I assume there would be violence. If you said to the guy who has 60% support in Republican primaries, according to national polls, if you said you don't have a chance to vote for him, I'm sorry, he's disqualified. Just like you, if you were 34 years old, he'd be disqualified. If he wasn't born in the United States, he'd be disqualified. Well, we disqualify him because they're not going to do it. Hope I'm wrong. I don't know if I hope I'm wrong, because I'm not sure it's the right thing to do. Yeah.
Could you comment about our current Supreme Court and the voting rights?
We have a very unusual situation right now. Okay, Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 elections. That's never happened in American history, that one political party won the popular vote that many times. Now, none of them are landslides. We don't have landslides anymore because the country is divided pretty narrowly politically. But Democrats have won 7 of the last 8 popular votes, but because we have the Electoral College, which was put into the Constitution for reasons I can tell you about if you're curious, but which there is no good theoretical justification for today, because of that, Republicans won 2 more of those elections, and 5 of today's justices were put on the court by Republican presidents who did not win a plurality of the vote. Now, if you combine that, right, Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes. That's not a few votes, but she doesn't win the Electoral College because of the way 70,000 votes in 3 states fell. If you take that into account, and then you take into account what Mitch McConnell did in 2016, which nobody's done in the history of the country, saying we're not going to fill this vacancy, which, by the way, would have given Democrats the first 5-4 control of the court since 1969. Mitch McConnell essentially stole a Supreme Court seat by making up a rule that you do not fill vacancies in the last year of a presidency. Then when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died a few weeks before the 2020 election, he made himself a liar by saying, well, of course, we can fill the seat. They did it literally a week before the election. So notice this, you have a country that clearly is left of center, not dramatically left, but left of center. The 50 Democratic senators, actually, after the 2020 election, there were 50 Democratic senators. They represented 40 million more voters than the 50 Republican senators. So you have a Senate and an Electoral College, which are systematically biased today against Democrats, not historically, not inevitably, but today are biased against Democrats. So you have a Supreme Court that is the most conservative court, according to political scientists, since the 1930s, with a slightly left of center country. What does that court do? They cut the Voting Rights Act. They make it harder to bring voting rights cases under the part of the act that still exists. They refuse to strike down gerrymandering, which is the reason why Republicans control the House, even though they win fewer votes in the House because of aggressive gerrymandering. And they unleash money. The Supreme Court is responsible for the fact that you can spend $1 billion on an election promoting your own candidacy or somebody else's, as long as you don't contribute it to the campaign. They gutted Biden's debt relief, which, whether you like it or not, may actually be the most important thing the court's done influencing the election, because that would, whether you agree with it or not, The Supreme Court, based on a made-up doctrine that did not exist 20 years ago, said an administrative agency cannot do what the statute clearly tells it can do, which is to waive debts owed to the federal government. That was $500 billion, and I bet you there are hundreds of thousands of young people, and the relief disproportionately benefited people of color, I believe the majority, who will say, what's the point of voting for Joe Biden? He didn't do what he said he would do. Well, he did do what he said he would do, and the Supreme Court struck it down. So you have a court that's systematically, not even getting into abortion and affirmative action and gun control, a court that to the extent it has influence also undermines democracy by refusing to slow down gerrymandering, by unleashing money in politics, and by gutting the voting rights act. In some ways, the most useful thing the court could have done was strike down partisan gerrymandering. A vast amount of our current political dysfunction is a result of gerrymandering. So just consider Texas for 1 second. There are essentially no competitive seats in Texas. There's one congressional district that realistically could go in either direction. And at the state level, I think there are 100 members of the lower house. I would be surprised if more than 1 or 2 out of 100 are competitive. Now ask yourself, what does that mean? It means the general election doesn't matter, right? Given how precisely divided the nation is, you're never going to win a 60-40 district if you're not in the 60. So all that matters is the primary. Who votes in primaries? It's 10 to 15% of the general electorate, and it's only the most extreme voters. So you're not only talking about one slice of the electorate, but you're talking about a slice of that slice. And in terms of money, all of the big contributors and almost all of the small contributors are also the most ideological extreme. The big funders are the Koch brothers, who only care about economic issues. The small funders are the evangelicals who care about abortion and so forth and so on. And so primary elections produce a Republican Party in Texas which passes an abortion law, which you have, if you had a referendum in Texas, that law would come nowhere near passing. And the same thing is true about the laws they passed with regard to gun control. Even the most extreme gun control, pro-gun state is passing a law that its citizens would not vote for because of the extreme morass of partisan gerrymandering and money in politics. And the court could fix that. And that shouldn't be a partisan issue. There's no good argument for gerrymandering. Democrats sometimes do it, although actually Democrats fight this fight with one hand tied behind their back, because in some Democratic states like California and New Jersey, they turn it over to a impartial commission. So you could gerrymander the hell out of California's 51 or 52 congressional seats. You could probably design California districts so that Republicans had 1 or 2 representatives in California. But the Democratic legislature is not drawing the seats. It's a nonpartisan citizens commission. So there are 12 Republicans in the California delegation, which is not unreasonable. California has about a third Republicans. But if you look at Texas, you're not going to find anything like that. And in North Carolina, which is a 50-50 state where Democrats control the governorship, after the next congressional elections, there are going to be 14 representatives and 10 or 11 of them are going to be Republican. So Democrats are fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and the Supreme Court should have said, nobody gets to do this, but they didn't do it, probably because they're Republican. I hate to say that. It's hard to deny. Yeah.
Your point about how the South before where this important education was potentially more modern, which is the South. My father grew up in Mississippi, mother was white, was public health nurse, took care of black and white. And graduated from high school in 1944 and raised 3 children and did for themselves. So what's happened? And then those stories of the 60s thought education was going to make this better. We thought civil rights acts were passed. We thought people were going to become more open in their thinking. And instead, it seems like it's gone the other way, and Republicans have really caught on controlling education as a message. But what's the future? How do we that where it all started? I mean, break the cycle from generation to generation through education.
I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future because I spend so much of my time with young people, and young people don't have any problems with regard to racial diversity and racial tolerance. I actually think that there's a very optimistic story. It's hard to have an interracial democracy. There's no nation in the world that ever had to experience that. The United States is trying to become the first true interracial democracy in the world, and I think we're actually going to be successful. I think we have a very difficult transitional period in which a white Christian nationalist minority, people who thought the United States was a white Christian country, for most of its history it was, they are seeing that disappearing very quickly, and that it's very difficult for them to deal with. But it's inevitable, right? You can do whatever you want to do. You're still going to have a majority that's not white, and the country is losing its religiosity at an unbelievably rapid pace. Some people might think that's good, some people might think that's bad. But if you look at how many people believe in God, how many people go to church, the changes in the last 30 years are unbelievably rapid. So, it's a mistake to downplay the changes. The country had a black president. Harvard Law School had no black faculty in 1965. We have lots of African-American faculty, Asian-American faculty. My students get along really well with each other without regard to race. They have interracial friends. 95% I forgot to mention this one. In 1960, 95% of Americans opposed interracial marriage, and in 2020, 95% of Americans said they support interracial marriage. Those are huge changes. If it's easier to compare it to something, think about the changes with regard to same-sex marriage. Nobody took same-sex marriage seriously in the mid-1980s. You still had a majority supporting the criminalization of same-sex consensual sex. And 70 to 75% of Americans now support same-sex marriage. That is a fundamental change. Every year, it's 1 or 2% more who support it. In another 20 years, the whole country will wonder, why did we ever have a fight about same-sex marriage? And somebody may disagree with that, but I hate to tell you, you're going to lose on it. Some issues, you can see what's happening, and it is an intergenerational change. And I think that's true about race. What's happened is this dysfunctional thing where you've managed to have a political party that sees advantage to sowing resentment. But the changes even within that party are dramatic, right? Herschel Walker was the Republican Party's candidate for governor. Tim Scott is a black Republican senator from South Carolina. Those things were inconceivable in the 1950s. Herschel Walker could not have been a candidate. And, when somebody, a local commissioner in Oklahoma, is heard on a hot mic saying, the good old days when we used to lynch people, the Republican governor immediately says you need to leave. So that is progress. But what you're going to have, I think, in the next 10 years is this incredible fight. And it's not just about race, it's also about religion. It's also about immigration, which is partly about race. And it's about some other things as well. But it's culture more than anything, and it's people who are so deeply aggrieved by the world. The one thing that defines Republican voters and Democratic voters more than anything is if you say to them, do you think the country is better off, are you better off than in the 1950s? Do you prefer the way the country is today than in the 1950s? Something like 90% of Republican voters think things have gotten worse in the country, and something like 80 to 90% of Democratic voters think it got better, right? It's not African Americans who are disadvantaged in all the ways I noted, who are trying to burn things down, right? It's whites, often Christian whites, Christian nationalist whites, who see their world disappearing and are willing to use violence. And I think that will go away pretty soon. But the problem is you have a political system that gives them a substantial boost, right? They can win the presidency without winning the popular vote. I don't know anybody who thinks Trump can win the popular vote, but he lost if 40,000 voters, 43,000 voters that switched sides, he would be president, even though he lost the popular vote by 7 million, right? That's a problem. And Democrats may never control the Senate. I hate to be alarmist. Democrats may never control the Senate after the 2024 election. And that's a real problem. And Democrats needed to do something about that. All you had to do was make DC a state, which just requires a statute. It was an obvious thing to do, and they didn't do it. And Joe Biden doesn't appreciate the things that are necessary to do in this alarming state, and that's a real problem. And Joe Manchin isn't really a Democrat, so he didn't really have control.
A wonderful presentation. Thank you. As we heard from your presentations and also based on the statistical data, in 100 years, maybe white people might be minorities in the United States. That's the case.
In 20 years.
In 20 years, 100 years have been wrong. At that moment, white people might think discrimination, racial discrimination, or something based on the color. To fight that type of situations, what do you suggest for two political parties, Democratic and Republican parties? Therefore, they can work in empowering people of color. As Barack Obama and people of color had already elected, and Vice President Kamala Harris also elected. In this situation, what empowerment the policy both of the parties can bring, therefore, in the long run, nobody will feel any discrimination based on the minority or based on the population or something.
Well, here's another reason to be optimistic. I mean, you know, my father was a Polish Jew who came to the United States in 1929. I mean, Jews face much of the same, but not all the same discrimination as African Americans. My father couldn't get a job in the university economics department because they all had quotas. Harvard had quotas on Jews. Jews were subject to the same racially restrictive covenants. The immigration law of 1924 was mostly addressed for Jews and Catholics. The Irish used to be treated as lower class citizens. When you talked about immigration in 1910, you talked about Italian Catholics and Polish Jews as if they were subordinate races, they were racially inferior, and most people aren't even aware of that history. So what happened over the course of time is that other groups became white, and African Americans had a harder time. But, you know, we made a lot of progress, and we'll make a lot more progress. What we needed to do, and this is not just for African Americans, for everybody's benefit, we had a Marshall Plan after World War II. We invested in Europe, recovering, partly for humanitarian reasons, altruistic reasons, but also because the United States didn't want them to be communists, and because the United States wanted to market for its goods. It's to nobody's benefit to have a Black minority underclass in the cities where they end up being incarcerated, and you end up having families that are not two-parent families, and that leads to certain pathologies and so forth. That was to nobody's benefit. So what you needed to do then, when the country felt like it was the richest country in the world and was fighting a war on poverty, you needed a big investment. And we didn't do that, partly because there was racial resentment, partly because politicians like George Wallace were already stoking racial resentment, but also because of the Vietnam War, because President Johnson wanted guns, you know, and butter, and at some point they were competing with each other, because Black people in the cities decided the civil rights legislation doesn't do anything for us, there aren't any jobs, the police harass us in our own streets, and they exploded with anger, which is not a good political strategy, and because of crime. So it turns out the baby boom generation came of criminal age at exactly this moment, and Americans got obsessed with crime. And so the war on poverty lasted for a couple of years, and then it was ended. And I think we needed a domestic Marshall Plan to create jobs and better housing, and we didn't do it. I'm not going to do it then. So the hope now is that, you know, I don't know what's going to happen. So that problem of inner city people who, you know, the people who live lives like in one television program. Right? That's a huge problem, and we're not doing anything to solve that. I think the Republican Party's solution is an economic opportunity. You have Tim Scott to say the Republican Party is the party of economic opportunity. That's why Jackie Robinson was a Republican. That's why the great football player Jim Brown voted for Richard Nixon in 19. They believe Republicans were the party of opportunity. But the Republicans were also the party of racialism.
Great conversation. Thank you very much. I just wanted a couple of things here. So please join our community event. Can you hear me? I don't know what words like he does, huh?
It's on,
So please join our community event tomorrow, our theater at 5 o'clock. You're welcome to take your program with you, and because we'll be using the same program for tomorrow, otherwise you can, if you want, you can leave it over there by the door. So thank you, Cathedral of the Pines, for hosting us. This was a wonderful co-sponsored event. And we also want to just thank our generous donors, the Ridge Women's Club. The Community Center of Jaffrey, the M&T Bank, the Savings Bank of Waltham, and the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. But I also just wanted to say, on behalf of the MLK committee, I just want to do a particular shout out to Peggy Guida. She's our tireless chairperson. She has a community vision, and she worked hard to make these events happen and to keep her little committee organized. So thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you all for coming. There's still more refreshments. Hang out a little bit, turn up the heat a little bit. I think thank you very much.
Put this on your on the desk in there until tomorrow. It's from Bill.